The storm arrived without warning, turning what had begun as a peaceful camping weekend into a night that would change two strangers forever. The wind howled through the towering pine trees like a wounded animal, rain slashed across the mountainside, and tents began collapsing one after another. I remember tightening every rope I could reach, praying my tiny shelter would survive the storm. Then, through the sheets of rain, I saw another tent lift into the air for a single terrifying second before crashing to the ground. A young woman stood beside it, soaked from head to toe, holding what remained of her broken shelter. She looked exhausted, cold, and completely alone. Then, somehow, in the middle of all that chaos, she smiled with heartbreaking warmth and quietly admitted that maybe we could share my tent tonight. I had no idea that a single sentence spoken during the darkest storm of my life would lead me to discover a story so heartbreaking that it would stay with me forever. Before we continue, if you believe kindness still exists, if you believe one small act of compassion can completely change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us humanity is still alive. I had always loved solitude. After losing both my parents within 2 years and watching my engagement fall apart only months later, the mountains became the only place where my heart felt quiet. Every few months I escaped into nature carrying only my backpack, a small tent, and memories that refused to leave me. Out there, away from the noise of the world, grief became easier to carry. I could breathe again. I could cry without anyone asking questions. That weekend was supposed to be another journey of healing, but fate had prepared something very different. The campground sat beside a crystal-clear lake surrounded by ancient forests. Families laughed around campfires, children chased butterflies, and couples watched the sunset reflecting on the water. I noticed the young woman only once before the storm arrived. She was setting up her tent by herself, struggling with one of the poles while pretending everything was under control. She thanked an elderly couple who offered help but insisted she could manage alone. There was something about her quiet determination that caught my attention, though I quickly looked away. Everyone carries invisible battles, and I had learned not to ask questions. As evening approached, the peaceful sky transformed into dark rolling clouds. Camp organizers warned everyone to secure their campsites, but few expected the violence that followed. The first gust nearly knocked me off my feet. Branches snapped overhead. Rain fell so heavily that the world disappeared behind a gray curtain. I fought desperately to keep my tent standing, but between flashes of lightning I saw hers collapse completely. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She simply stood there in the rain holding a torn piece of fabric while everyone else rushed to protect their own belongings. Something inside me refused to let her face the night alone. I grabbed my flashlight, ran through the storm, and offered the only shelter I had. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable accepting help from a stranger, but the freezing temperature left little choice. We gathered what little remained of her equipment and hurried into my tent just before another powerful gust flattened the place where her shelter had stood. The tent was small, barely large enough for one person. We sat on opposite sides wrapped in blankets while rain hammered above us like thousands of tiny drums. For several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt like two wounded souls recognizing something familiar in each other. Eventually she thanked me, not with dramatic words but with quiet sincerity that carried the weight of someone who rarely depended on others. As the storm continued outside, she slowly began sharing pieces of her life. Her name was Emily. She had spent the last 3 years caring for her younger brother after their parents died in a car accident. She gave up university, worked 2 jobs, and sacrificed every dream she once had because keeping him safe mattered more than anything else. Only recently had her brother earned a scholarship that allowed him to move into student housing. For the first time in years she had one free weekend, and instead of celebrating, she came to the mountains hoping to remember who she used to be before responsibility consumed every part of her life. Listening to her story made my own pain feel strangely connected to hers. We were 2 strangers carrying different tragedies yet searching for the same thing, a reason to believe life still held beauty beyond loss. I found myself sharing truths I had never spoken aloud to anyone. I admitted how guilt haunted me after my father's illness because I constantly wondered whether I could have done more. I confessed that after my fiancée left, I convinced myself I wasn't worth staying for. The mountains had become my escape from questions I could never answer. The storm lasted most of the night. We talked until exhaustion finally replaced sadness. There was no romance, no dramatic declarations, only two human beings reminding each other that surviving heartbreak doesn't always require perfect answers. Sometimes it only requires someone willing to listen without judgment. Morning arrived with golden sunlight washing away every trace of the storm. The forest smelled fresh, birds returned to their songs, and volunteers helped campers repair damaged tents. Emily thanked me once more and insisted she would head home after breakfast. Before leaving, she handed me a small folded piece of paper. Inside was a simple message saying that kindness given to strangers is never forgotten. At the bottom she wrote her phone number, adding that if I ever needed someone to remind me life was still worth living, I should call. Weeks passed before I found the courage. On one particularly difficult evening, when memories threatened to overwhelm me again, I sent a short message asking how she was doing. Her reply came almost immediately. We talked for hours. Those conversations became daily habits. There were no expectations. We simply encouraged each other through ordinary days that no longer felt quite so lonely. Months later she invited me to volunteer at a community shelter where she spent every Saturday serving meals to homeless families. Watching her comfort frightened children and elderly people with genuine compassion revealed something extraordinary. Despite everything life had taken from her, she still chose generosity. She never measured people by their appearance or circumstances. She believed everyone deserved dignity, especially during their hardest moments. Inspired by her example, I began volunteering regularly. Slowly my life transformed. Instead of hiding from pain, I discovered purpose through helping others carry theirs. The grief over my parents never disappeared, but it no longer controlled every decision. Their memory became motivation rather than chains. One winter afternoon, nearly a year after the storm, Emily received devastating news. Her younger brother had been diagnosed with a rare illness requiring expensive treatment. The insurance covered only part of the cost. I watched fear return to her eyes for the first time since we met. Yet she refused to ask anyone for help. She started taking extra shifts, sleeping only a few hours each night, determined to save her brother once again. This time, however, she wasn't alone. The volunteers from the shelter organized fundraisers. Campers from that mountain campground remembered her story after someone shared it online. Neighbors donated what little they could. Complete strangers mailed letters filled with encouragement. Within weeks enough money had been raised to begin treatment. Emily cried harder than I had ever seen, overwhelmed not by charity but by the realization that kindness always finds its way back to those who give it freely. Her brother slowly recovered. Doctors called it remarkable progress. Emily called it proof that hope survives wherever compassionate hearts refuse to give up. One evening we returned together to the same campground where our lives first crossed paths. New tents dotted the lakeside. Children laughed around campfires exactly as they had before. Standing beside the place where her old tent once collapsed, she smiled through grateful tears. She admitted that losing everything during that storm had felt like another cruel punishment from life. Looking back, however, she realized it wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a completely different chapter neither of us could have imagined. I understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes life tears down the shelter we carefully build because something stronger waits beyond the ruins. We spend so much time mourning what collapsed that we fail to notice the people standing nearby ready to help us rebuild. Years later people often asked how we met. They expected an exciting romance or dramatic coincidence. We simply smiled and said a storm introduced us. Few realize that the strongest connections are often born not during life's brightest days but during its darkest nights when compassion matters more than comfort. If this story has touched your heart even a little, please support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with your family and friends, subscribing for more emotional stories, and leaving a heartfelt comment. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need hope today. Special request, before the story ends, please comment with the words, "Kindness always returns," if you believe even the smallest act of compassion can change someone's life forever. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains that evening, we watched campers helping one another pitch tents before another forecasted storm. Some offered extra blankets. Others shared food with complete strangers. No one asked for anything in return. In that simple moment I finally understood the lesson life had been trying to teach me all along. Strength is not measured by how long we stand alone. Real strength appears when we allow ourselves to give help, receive help, and believe that even after the fiercest storms, hearts broken by loss can still become homes for hope. Sometimes all it takes is one collapsing tent, one unexpected smile, and one simple act of kindness to remind us that miracles rarely arrive with fireworks. More often, they arrive quietly, disguised as strangers who refuse to let us face the night alone. And that is why, whenever rain begins to fall, I no longer remember the storm that destroyed a tent. I remember the night compassion built a family out of two lonely hearts, proving that the greatest shelters in this world are not made from fabric or rope, but from love, mercy, and the courage to care for someone when they need it most.